Welcome to ED 621C Module 10, Creating Rubrics, Checklists, and Rating Scales. Actually, what we're going to be talking about in this module will be creating rubrics for your culminating performance tasks. You will need for this module to have read over the course overview to know what your assignments and due dates are. And you'll need to have in hand your culminating performance tasks completed from Module 9 so that you can use them to develop the rubric for Module 10. So what this PowerPoint is going to go over is developing rubrics and the elements to develop a rubric, because they are time consuming and they do have a few guidelines that you need to follow when you develop them. So why are rubrics useful? They provide authentic assessment based directly on learning targets, in this case your culminating performance tasks. They tend to reduce teacher-to-teacher variations in grading, and that is the language in the rubric is what does that, and that's what's very important, specific, clear language. They provide both a quantitative and qualitative measure of student success and growth. They help a teacher assess student products more objectively and fairly on a set of uniform criteria, and actually students can also assess themselves because they provide students clarity about the criteria upon which they will be assessed, so that it's a two-way street, and rubrics are very handy that way. Then everybody kind of knows what's expected. So basically, you've developed your criteria in the GRASPs. You have a list of success criteria. Now you're going to measure that criteria based on a scale of this says 3 to 6 points, but just keep it simple. Don't make it huge numbers of points, neither too small so it doesn't carry enough weight. And then you're going to describe the criteria from not acceptable to excellent, meets standards, or above standard, however you want to categorize them. You're going to describe the degree of quality or proficiency of understanding along that continuum, and that's different than a checklist or rating scale. For example, a rubric that assesses increasing control of the 6 facets of understanding is designed as a continuum, which you'll see in the Wiggins and McTighe book on page 178 and 179, which you want to think about using those 6 facets of understanding in your rubrics. So a rubric answers these questions. By what criteria should a performance be judged and discriminated? Where should we look and what should we look for to judge performance success? And how should the different levels of quality, proficiency, and our understanding be described and distinguished from one another? And that's probably the hardest thing, is to distinguish each category from one another. And that's why you don't want to have too many categories. So there are 2 types of rubric, analytic and holistic. Holistic gives you an overall impression of students' work and yields a single score or rating for a product. So here they are kind of going fist to fist. But you can see in the holistic you have a number and you have a descriptor, a number, descriptor, number, descriptor. And so it comes down to kind of one general descriptor, qualitative descriptor of students' work per category. Whereas our analytic rubrics have, we'll break these down, various levels of performance and dimensions to judge separately. A distinct score is provided for each trait or dimension. For example, if any of you use 6 traits of writing, that is an analytic. Generally, there are some holistic scoring for 6 traits, but generally they're analytic scores on idea, organization, voice, word choice, sentence fluency, and conventions. And if you're doing a writing piece and you have a particular element in your rubric that addresses writing, I highly recommend you find and use a grade level appropriate 6 traits of writing rubric to use and modify for your rubrics. There's nothing to say that you can't use something that's already done, as long as it meets the needs of your culminating performance task and your evaluation of it. For our purpose of assessing understanding, an analytic rubric is preferable because it provides a much higher quality of feedback that provides specific information to students and parents. Never forget the parents. So I'm going to walk you through 15 tips for designing great rubrics. This doesn't have a lot of visuals, but you can see that we're making rubrics, and the rubrics are about the students. 1, don't make task-specific rubrics. So don't make a rubric that's just about eating, but a rubric that's general enough that you can reuse it for another assessment. Number 2, don't be excessively general. While you avoid making the test too specific, don't make it too general either. You don't want to make, for example, a project rubric and try and use that rubric to judge a PowerPoint or a poster. Um, use, you know, use your criteria and your global picture of what you're having students do. Remember the golden mean and aim for mid-level generalization in your rubric. We're going to talk about a few at the end of this PowerPoint. Avoid dysfunctional detail. Your rubric, don't make it 10 pages. Keep it to 1 page. Keep your rubric to 1 page. And yet you want to avoid specific detail, but you want to provide enough information so that another person can use that same rubric and score and get about the same results as you do. And in your the rubric for your rubrics, there is an element that talks about just that. It's like, is it reliable? Could I take the rubric, or could another teacher take the rubric and score your culminating performance task and get the same results close enough to what you get, that inner rate of reliability? That's very, very important because you're not always going to be there. You know what you mean, but other people don't. So make sure you don't assume anything. Keep it simple to 1 page. And no smaller than 12-point font, please, because then it becomes too small. And if you remember, I think I mentioned in one of the sessions, is that for students, generally you want to stick to 14-point font. There's been research that shows the font size really matters in terms of readability. Focus on a limited number of dimensions, and we'll talk about the dimensions, but they're the main areas you care about. You care about the writing, you care about the poster organization, you care about the format of the letter, you care about whatever it is. Those are the dimensions. So it's quality of letter, organization of poster, and so forth. So if we're doing a rubric, a performance rubric for a restaurant, where are we looking? We're looking at food, service, and atmosphere and price. I forgot to make that orange. If you're rating physical fitness, the dimensions might be strength, endurance, and flexibility. By limiting the number of dimensions to no more than 4 or 5, you'll be able to do a more thorough job of developing each one. And you'll be forced to set priorities for what really matter, what you really are looking for. So avoiding all these crazy details, just looking at the main elements. And you want to think about your goals or your objectives when you're building your rubrics. Even though you have your even as you have your set criteria for the interior parts. So your criteria, like your objectives, tells you where to look and what to look for. You're looking for the quality. So the criteria, the quality, the dimensions are the areas you're looking at. The criteria are the quality and the details of each dimension. So again, if we look at the restaurant model and you're looking at quality of food, it might be flavor, appearance, and healthfulness. And then flavor, no flavor, bland flavor, salty, many spices, complex, and delicious. And how do you rate delicious? Don't use the word delicious. In the restaurant scenario, service criteria might have to do with the server's promptness, efficiency, and attitude. And then you just grade them according to the level of quality in each dimension. I will say this last bullet, it's less certain. You can teach your students to be creative, inventive, or imaginative. So you may not want to include such criteria in your rubric. So these are exceedingly difficult to write descriptors for. So if you write the word imaginative, then you need to be able to describe exactly what imaginative looks like. And as it says, it's very hard to describe what imaginative looks like. So how else are you going to judge the student's criteria and performance? Same with inventive, same with creative. They need to be, just like this says your objectives, they need to be measurable and time bound. You need to be able to observe certain criteria of those elements. As much as possible, choose criteria that you can actually observe and quantify. I was just saying this, or that you can at least mark present or not present, that it exists or it doesn't exist. In our restaurant analogy, we can measure things such as how long it takes a server to show up to take our order and how much fat and cholesterol is in the food. So that tells you if the server is prompt. That tells you if the food is healthy. But instead of saying healthy, you'd say how much fat and cholesterol is in the food. How long does it take the server to show up? And you can determine whether the place is too noisy or carrying on a conversation. If we spy cockroaches scurrying along the baseboards, these things can be observed and measured. In our classroom rubrics, we want to look for the same sorts of concrete, measurable criteria. Is it legible? Do the links work? Because we can measure these things. So legibility, and if they have links for their project, can you open the links and do they work? Set descriptors carefully and keep them objective. If you may be tempted to use relative terms, avoid them at all costs. Best, better, larger, smaller, those words, don't use them. Don't use the words poor, fair, and good, excellent, minimal, adequate. They beg the issue, what is the difference between those, and how do you actually measure poor, fair, good, excellent, minimal, adequate, fully developed? How do you measure those? How much detail is enough for an idea to be fully developed? You have to decide, but remember that too little is as bad as, or is ineffective as too much. Too little won't give enough information. Too much is too much. When the rubric results will be viewed by students, it's also important to consider the emotional aspects of the value-laden terms, such as boring or poorly presented. So even when students are helping design the rubric, and they will give you words that you yourself as a teacher wouldn't use, it's important to keep the students professional in their descriptors. And we'll look at a few of those. We'll look at one of those at the end here. To provide specific feedback without discouraging your students, it's better to identify the actual traits you're looking for that constitute acceptable versus unacceptable performance. If an acceptable presentation is one that begins with a hook, ties facts together, and ends with a strong point, then say so. Aim to 4 or 5 levels. You don't want more. Then you end up splitting hairs. Try for 4. If you need 5, fine. 3 is too few. The problem with using 3 is that you probably won't be able to make fine enough discriminations. This will depend on the grade level. However, with young students, 3 can be plenty. It is fair and acceptable to give students feedback on work that does not meet the goal, objective, or standard of the task. You need to be prepared to have a descriptor which indicates that work does not meet the objective on any or most of the criteria being evaluated. And this is what parents want to see. It's always important to explain the rubric and the use of it to the students before you use it. This will defer a lot of confusion. Keep the distance between the levels equal. You can read this one. Put another way, the work that's the 4 on your rubric should be 4 times better than the 1 on your rubric. That's an interval scale, and you're creating graduated performance indicators for the descriptors. To avoid creating an ordinal scale that merely ranks one product performance as better than another. That's why you don't use numerical differentiation, like 5 spelling words, 4 spelling words, 3 spelling words, 2 spelling words. That's probably the one place where you would have ordinal differentiation. But for anything else, like 5 pictures, 4 pictures, 3 pictures, 2 pictures, no. You don't want to use an ordinal scale because it minimizes the quality of what you're looking at. The only time you use ordinal is if it really applies, for example, spelling words. The more interval like your scale, the sounder your rubric will be. So each one is better than the next, is better than the next, is better than the next. You can include your students in creating or adapting the rubric. And in your case, for this class, you're not going to have an opportunity to do that. But it is a very good practice to do this, since students will have some agency or some ownership of the rubric then. And in one research class we did, a teacher did actually have the students help develop the rubric, and it was highly successful. So when you get the chance and you're using rubrics in the class, using the students as co-creators in the rubric is a terrific idea. They'll have a head start on understanding what the expectations are, they'll know where the target is, they're more likely to buy in the work, and their good ideas will add to the quality of the rubric itself. Another important piece, and this is something you really have to pay attention to, is to make sure that the language from column to column is similar, that syntax and wording correspond. So if in one column you have a correct writing format and correct spelling, then the next format's going to have, the next column will have correct writing format and correct spelling. It may look qualitatively different because you're changing the scale as you're moving up the ladder, but you will always have quality of writing and spelling in all 4 criteria dimensions on the rubric, because that's what you're assessing. You don't want to add and readability on the 3rd one, or legibility. You want to have all legibility from the beginning. Don't add it later. If you think, oh, I got to add legibility, add it, go back and add it. Go back and add it, but make sure that you have the same criteria addressed in each level of performance, in each performance level. Even if it's about having or not having something. You need to make sure that the descriptors are very clear, they're very specific, and they're very transparent to students, all in student-friendly languages. The people that are going to be using this rubric are students. You are going to be using it to evaluate the students, but the students are the ones who need to understand the language in the rubric. And I skipped right ahead to number 12. Students need to understand the language in the rubric. If you use academic language or concepts in the rubric, then you'll need time to teach the students those meanings and concepts before they use the rubric. So that obviously is part of instruction. And so the rubric is also, because you know that assessments are also a basis for instruction, this rubric for your culminating performance test is also a basis for instruction. It's what you're aiming for, this evaluation. So of course it can be used as an instructional tool. Use the rubric with your students, please. Best practice is to pre-teach and use the rubric with the students. It means nothing to them if you don't. We've all had that time when we gave students the rubric and they threw it away, or the papers lay across the room like snow at the end of class. I kind of like that image. In order for students to keep a rubric, and more importantly to find it useful in terms of their learning, they must see a reason for using it. Make sure they understand that the rubric is there to help them reflect, self-assess, unpack, critique, and do more with what they are learning. It's also very useful for conversation points with parents, as we've said, and students, again, are the stakeholders of the rubric. Don't use too many columns. Same as don't use too many categories, too many performance criteria columns, because then you end up stretching things out. That's when I said earlier, 5 is probably the maximum you want to use. 3 is a minimum that you want to use, because otherwise you're stretching things out and you're trying to figure out how to distinguish between each one, and it becomes almost impossible to make them meaningful. Rely on descriptive language. Again, not using the numbers. Don't rely on numbers. Avoid words like good and excellent. So this is kind of reiterating some stuff we just talked about. The language should focus on the quality and the nature of what you're teaching. What is the difference between using Wikipedia and original article? It isn't about the number of sources, and excellent is too vague for students. Be specific and descriptive. Why is it important not to use Wikipedia? Why is it important to use original article? Okay, so here's some comments that teachers have made on using rubrics. These are just a few comments that I thought were important to share with you, based on the 15 points that we just covered. Providing a copy of the rubric for students to self-assess. Giving students a rubric was huge. From that day on, students showing work ceased to be a problem. They all realized that everything in class became an opportunity for assessment or feedback. Assessment is another word for feedback. I was clear about my expectations and they rose to meet them. Another teacher said, I think of a rubric as a description of the quality of thinking. So you're looking at potentially how students are using their thinking to create, to identify their learning, to provide you evidence of understanding. In general, I think you should avoid raw counts with rubrics. As I said earlier, doing numbers doesn't really give you an idea of how students think, and it doesn't give you an idea of the quality of their work, unless it's something that really specifically lends itself to raw counts. One question I have is whether students were given an example of what each rubric point might look like. What does it mean to identify skills? Do they need to write out the name of the standard or simply use it in their work? This was in response to a rubric. And identify skills is one of those terms that is too vague. What does that mean? If a student doesn't know what identify skills means, And you cannot assume that they know, and it's not fair to assume that they know even after instruction. You as the developer and the students as the co-developers need to identify, what does that mean? What skills are they identifying? What's important? What is important? So let's deconstruct a rubric. This is just the basic skeleton of a rubric. You have your task description. You have your dimensions, which are the criteria. Generally, the criteria that you're assessing go on the left side. The dimensions, which are the areas you're looking for. We'll look at a couple rubrics so it'll become more clear. Across the top of the description of the dimensions, which are the criteria: acceptable, not acceptable, very acceptable. You always want to have one that shows that it's not acceptable, or that it provides no information that you can score, because otherwise you have nothing. And then scale, the top of your scale is going to be what it looks like as an exceptional product. And as we mentioned before, you want to make sure in assessments to give students an idea of what an exceptional product looks like, and what in each level of product looks like. You'll find, I'll use 6 traits of writing again, you'll find that they actually give students models to deconstruct. Why does this a level 1? Why is this a level 2? Why is this a level 3? And then the students look through that material and they decide why it's level 1, level 2, and level 3. Together, they deconstruct it. So let's look at a few rubrics. This one is a research project. Here you have a section from a rubric developed by a teacher together with her upper elementary students to assess an animal assignment. Part of the assignment was to develop and then explain a product related to the chosen animal. In addition to rating the student's presentation, the rest of the rubric looks at the student's choice of animal, research plan, and note-taking. So this green is just the one section on presentation. The students helped the teacher make it, and you can see the help that they gave her or him by the language they use: boring, sloppy, unprepared, not finished. This is in progress. So this doesn't even say not enough information, but it's just the lowest criterion level of the 4. So, not practiced, quiet voice, mistakes in products, good, clear voice, new information, neat product, practiced, accurate, looks real. So the presentation is clearly oral as well as written. Excellent. Creative, uses expression, motion, real looking product. So what works in this rubric? The students were involved in its creation. The teacher helped with the structure and the clarity. You can see that the teacher's hand in this. And the wording is general enough that the rubric can be repurposed. What doesn't work? What is the difference between looks real and real looking product? And how is that different between good and excellent? Define creative and define boring. And frankly, I wouldn't even use the word boring. I understand what they mean, but what does boring actually look like? And that's what it says. What does boring look like? It means it doesn't have any pictures, or it's just the voice presentation is flat. And it would probably be helpful to divide the dimension into 2. Have one for oral presentation skills and one for the appearance and quality of the product, because you can see how they're mixed in this in this rubric. Let's look at another one. Poster project. Students in a primary grade class were assigned to make posters about the sun. This rubric was created for students to use to self-assess their work. 2 of the 5 dimensions are shown here. Other dimensions included are at least 4 sources of information, sun's impact, discussion of the sun, past, present, and future. Now, I'm going to start by saying it doesn't hurt to have specific dimensions relative to the project. And this is what it says here, it doesn't make it useful for other projects. If you changed this to just say a labeled drawing, then it could be used for any kind of labeled drawings that students create. You just take off of the sun. That's when it means this is too specific. So what doesn't work? That'd be one of them, that this is too specific. Differentiate carelessly done versus drawing poorly. What is that? What do those mean? Minimum effort, executed well. None of those carry any kind of qualitative meaning. We don't know what that means. Everybody evaluates it differently. I would think minimum effort. How would I know minimum effort? If I came in and used that rubric with a student's product, how would I know about that student using minimum effort? what does it look like for it not to be satisfactory? Also, you see that there are 6, well, let's see, I'll do that first. So the 2 dimensions shown here are really specifications which should lend themselves to an assess assignment checklist, kind of like a holistic rubric. So there would be, there's a labeled drawing, the information needs to be accurate, and you could just make a checklist instead of making a large rubric. Doesn't matter, you can do it both ways, but it probably would lend itself better to a checklist. Oh, I wrote it twice. Commensurate with the decisions might be quality of drawing and information accuracy. Too many performance categories. So these 3 probably would be better combined into one. And then you would have satisfactory, good, and exceptional. And again, you'd need to tighten up the language because the language is just too vague and doesn't carry measurable qualitative information. Little or no information present, that'll work. Information made up, you can definitely measure that. Does not match poster, you can measure that. And then you get into these vague things again, and students aren't going to necessarily understand what they're actually expected to do without a lot of pre-teaching. Written presentation rubric. So why not just make the rubric well constructed to start with so you don't have to do a lot of pre-teaching of the rubric? This rubric is used to score the written portion of integrated presentations. Other dimensions on the rubric not shown here are main idea, vocabulary, voice style, and global assessment. So in this case, this is a writing rubric. What works is it's a simple sound rubric that could be used in a range of different assignments, clearly. Dimensions represent important aspects of the work, and the 4 performance levels are helpful. So you have 3, 2, 1. And now notice the other ones go from left to right. This one goes from right to left, low to high, high to low. Most of the criteria are clear and well defined, so you can measure them. Opinions are balanced and made in a point-by-point manner. They're presented and balanced. And as they get both sides of it, few opinions are given, no opinions are given. Details are missing or inaccurate, uses few details. Uses details to support the main idea. Not sure exactly what that means. So this is again specific language. Add to the overall clarity, and add to, what does that mean? Add to the overall clarity. What do they do? They use interesting details that ... Add to the overall clarity could be anybody's judgment, and so that immediately reduces the potency of the criteria and the performance level. So I mentioned earlier the 6 facets of understanding. These are from Wiggins and McTighe, and you know that there is an actual rubric on the use of these. These you want to try and incorporate into your rubrics if you can, because these are the 6 facets that show students can understand the material that you presented in your unit. You hopefully also have these evident in your culminating performance task, so it will make it easier. But just to remind you, and we've talked about them before, that these are like higher order thinking skills: explanation, interpretation, application, perspective, empathy, and self-knowledge. All these are ways that students can show you they understand the material that you've taught in the unit. So now that we've looked at the 6 facets for understanding, we're going to look at the actual task that you're being asked to do, which is to complete a culminating performance task rubric for each of your grasps. So you're going to, on the template, you've got room to put your student prompt with the heading of what it is for, and of course the title of your culminating performance task. And then the criteria to be met, which is the success criteria at the bottom of your grasp form, the S, the last S. So these bullets are what are going to guide your creation of the rubric. Each of these are going to be one dimension here. So I have, or they can be combined, but they have to all be present. Menu with a chart of nutritional values that is accurate and complete and provides at least one dietary modification. So you've got it embedded here. Letter to camp director here. USD guidelines here. Effective explanation of nutritional value and proposed menu in this letter. Proper letter form also here. Correct spelling and conventions here. And the food groups, which you don't see here as exactly including all those 4 food groups, but this would also be part of bullet number 1. So all those elements are in, all these criteria are in your rubric. I have four category, 4 levels of performance, from these meals will be great to where's the beef. It's okay to play with these, but it's important not to be glib. In other words, it's fine to play as long as the students either have input or understand what that this language means actually, and that you keep it professional, and you don't you watch the emotional content of your performance categories, because it can be hurtful, and we don't want that to be hurtful. You don't want to be sarcastic. You want to be just, it's okay to be a little funny and have fun with it, but also it's okay to just be straight with it. Don't worry about that. So your goal is to design a comprehensive rubric for each of your GRASP performance tasks that you designed in Module 9, based on the guidance from this presentation and related readings and videos. The technical criteria are that your rubric needs to have 4 to 5 levels of differentiation for scoring. It needs to have 4 to 6 different performance dimensions to be scored, no more than 6, preferably 4. Oh, no, I'm sorry, up above, preferably 4. 4 to 6 for the performance dimensions down the side. Content, the rubric must address the goals and objectives of your unit, specifically the success criteria of the related culminating performance task. That's why you listed them out, and those are what are going to be driving your rubrics. So with that, have fun with this puzzle of creating a rubric. It is time consuming. You're up to the task, and I will look forward to seeing your creative products for your CPTs. Enjoy.